Hello, thank you so much for joining us for what I know will be just a fascinating afternoon of conversation. I'm Jim Falk, President of the World Affairs Council of Dallas-Fort Worth. Even though that we are in this virtual environment, I remember how often Larry Wright has been a guest of the World Affairs Council, as well as the Dallas Museum of Arts and Letters Live. So even though we're speaking with Larry this afternoon virtually, on behalf of Carolyn Bess and all of our friends over at the Dallas Museum of Art, thank you for joining us. I also want to thank Dallas Baptist University for their promotional support. Just a few days ago, one of our members asked me, so how are things different now that you are in the COVID-19 environment? And I said, at least insofar as the programs department is concerned, it's really not quite as different as you might imagine. We're still working very hard to bring you, our members and supporters and the general public, some of the most interesting, smart, engaging people that we can. And certainly this afternoon's conversation with Larry Wright is an example of that. This afternoon's program is in large measure supported by a dear friend, Pat Patterson. Several years ago, when Pat was chairman of the World Affairs Council, a position she held for 3 years, her friends and family joined together to create the Pat Patterson Endowed Lecture. So Pat, I know you're watching, and thanks so much. To support the World Affairs Council, you can text dfwworld to 44321. And I know you're going to want to purchase a copy of The End of October if you've not yet already done so. And I hope you'll go to interabangbooks.com. They'll send you the book free of charge, free shipping, or now the bookstore is open, so you can go there, or if you prefer, Interabang is offering curbside delivery. So we're going to try something different for those of you who have already been participants with some of our council webinars. We're going to let you, if you wish, to use your audio, use your mic to ask questions. If you'd like to do that, just raise your hand and I will get to as many questions as I can. If you see the mic down below pop up at the bottom of your screen on the left-hand side, that means you're live. And when I call your name, you can just start talking. If you prefer not to do that, you can still go the old way and just write out your question, and we'll get to just as many as we can. So as I mentioned, Larry Wright is a good friend of the World Affairs Council and Arts and Letters Live. You know him as a best-selling author. He's a screenwriter, playwright, as well as a staff writer for the New Yorker magazine. The End of October is not the first time he has successfully looked into that crystal ball. It was back in 1998, he wrote the screenplay, The Siege, which predicted a series of terrorist attacks in New York City. In 2007, he won a Pulitzer Prize for what I think is really one of the best books to understand the current situation in the Middle East, and that is The Looming Tower. It really is the definitive account of the rise of Al-Qaeda. Larry lives in Austin, Texas, and is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Larry, thanks so much for spending an hour with us today.
It's good to be back with you, Jim.
So I know you've been asked this question 1,000 times, but I have to ask, when did you first decide to write this book, The End of October? And really, what was the catalyst that drove you to devote, 2 or 3 years of time researching it?
Actually, Jim, it started a decade ago as a screenplay for Ridley Scott. He had asked me, he had read that Cormac McCarthy book, The Road, and which is a post-apocalyptic novel about a father and a son wandering through the ruins of civilization. And Ridley's question was, well, what happened? It's not explained in the novel. And I thought that was a very interesting question. And so I was drawn to the idea of writing about a pandemic because as a young reporter, I had written several articles about disease outbreaks, and I was living in Atlanta where the Center for Disease Control is. And I was so enchanted by the world of public health and the epidemiologists. They just seemed like swashbuckling intellectuals, the really courageous people who would fly off and confront some novel disease. I'll tell you, I would rather be in a war zone. But these people, they go off in the face of danger and they solve these puzzles, which are the diseases that confront us. And I decided that a pandemic would be the most interesting way of crippling civilization. But Ridley didn't make the movie, and I'm glad he didn't. I hadn't solved the story problems, and I hadn't done the research that I needed to do. So I put it aside, and a few years ago in 2017, I pulled it out again and got back to work.
Well, I suspect there may be a movie still out of this book.
Well, Ridley's reattached himself as director. We'll see. Hollywood, you know.
You know, Larry, one of the things that people may not know who haven't followed you and read some of your books is your long interest in the Middle East, and particularly the years that you spent in Saudi Arabia. And what I found so interesting about this book, knowing you, is that you really have tied together so many of your interests: religion, politics, the Middle East. Tell us a little bit about your year in Saudi Arabia and what you were doing, and why you have really a sort of a special knowledge of the Hajj, the pilgrimage.
Well, it's an interesting question, Jim. After 9/11, you know, when I was starting work on the Looming Tower, I knew I had to go to Saudi Arabia in order to write about bin Laden, but the Saudis wouldn't let me in. You know, I was a journalist, and the last thing they wanted was a journalist. And so I found a job. The job was mentoring young reporters at a newspaper in Jeddah, which was bin Laden's hometown. So I became an expat worker, and that's something they allow in a big way. And but it was so much better than actually being a reporter in a hotel room. You know, I had a job. I had to go to work every day. I had all these young reporters that I was supervising. And I learned so much more about that country than I would ever had I been just a reporter. But one of my very first tasks was overseeing our coverage of the Hajj. And I couldn't go to Mecca myself, but I was in touch with my young reporters. And, you know, it occurred to me then that from a public health standpoint, these mass gatherings, like the pilgrimage to the Hajj or so many other pilgrimages and mass concerts and so on, represent a tremendous threat to public health. Every year there were outbreaks of disease in Mecca, some of them quite serious. And I thought, what would happen if, you know, something like the 1918 flu appeared in Mecca, and then suddenly everybody got on airplanes and flew to all parts of the globe simultaneously? You'd have a worldwide pandemic at once. So that thought never left me.
Indeed, you know, one of the reasons, I guess, that we're having such a challenge with COVID-19 is it happened during the Chinese New, or at least part of it was during the Chinese New Year. In Austin, you really dodged a bullet, didn't you?
Oh man, we would have been in the same spot as New Orleans if we hadn't canceled South by Southwest. It was a terrible loss for the city, a financial disaster for so many restaurants and bars, and you know, hundreds of millions of dollars just off the top. But many of these institutions depended on South by to get them through the rest of the year. And you know, setting aside COVID-19, you know, the scar from that is still going to mark Austin for a long time.
You know, Austin gets around 300,000 visitors a year just for that one, 1 week, 10-day event.
Yeah, it's an immense draw, and it's done a lot for the city in terms of gaining attention and help. I mean, my niece is a singer in LA, and this was going to be her big breakthrough. And you know, there were countless young artists like that didn't get their chance.
In fact, my niece had a feature film that was supposed to be premiered as well. Let's go back to 1918. I think that was the year with Philadelphia. Is that right? Where you had the Armistice Parade, and sort of set the context of this and really what it did to the city of Philadelphia.
You know, it's a sad story, Jim, because but it does remind me to some extent of some of the actions being taken right now. Health officials were warning that people had to not congregate in big crowds, and where they sheltered in place, you know, they were able to pretty much keep the infection under control. Like St. Louis was a good example, where they were managed to contain the contagion at a reasonable amount. But Philadelphia simply ignored that, and there was a bond parade. And you see from the pictures the mass of people that were gathered there, and it was just as the the contagion was about to explode, that's when they had this parade. And Philadelphia was one of the hardest hit cities in America.
Was there a debate about whether or not to have the parade at the time?
Well, there was discussion about it, but the city health officer and the mayor had made the decision that they didn't want to pass up the opportunity to sell those bonds and to get people out. You know, same forces that you feel at work now. People wanted to be outside. People wanted to gather. They wanted to congregate. They wanted to show off their patriotism. And you know, October 1918 was the deadliest month in American history. And a lot of that came from Philadelphia.
So it probably won't surprise viewers or people who know me. I did not take organic chemistry or majored in biology. Yeah. And you have done such a wonderful job of explaining sort of the alphabet soup of viruses. And I wonder if you might just take a minute or two and help us understand how the building blocks of the virus.
Well, I learned a lot about viruses, and there's a lot to know. There are trillions of them. You know, we have no idea how many there are, but there are many times more viruses than there are stars in the universe. Curtis Suttle, who is a marine biologist in Vancouver, you know, we used to think the ocean was sterile. No, it's not. You dump a bucket into a gallon of seawater, you'll find hundreds of thousands of viruses in that bucket. Suttle and his students put buckets up on top of the Pyrenees and to see if viruses traveled. And they found that, you know, they collected tens of thousands of viruses that seem to travel on the jet stream. They're everywhere. We don't know exactly what their mission is. They're all little lumps of protein. They have some mission, but ancient viruses that have infected us are a part of our DNA. Viral genomes viruses are in our genomes. They affect our memory. They're part of our cognition. You know, so we wouldn't be who we are without viruses. Now, there are DNA viruses and RNA viruses. And flu, for instance, is an RNA virus, and so is coronavirus. And one of the characteristics of an RNA virus is that it mutates. It's unstable. So far, coronavirus has been more stable than one would expect, but it always has the capacity to change. And
by that, you mean it can have just so many, I mean, I guess, protein clinical manifestations, right? I mean, everyone is different and can...
Yeah, we have small changes that have been registering in this strain. That's how we can tell where the viruses come from. But larger changes could affect how the viruses behave in our bodies or how contagious they might be. You know, in 1918, that flu mutated over the summer, which is one reason it was more fatal in the fall. You know, influenzas every year change. And when we try to make a vaccine for the next season's virus, you know, they're just guessing about how, you know, where the flu will go and how will it change. It's a very difficult science. And that's because these RNA viruses are a moving target.
Larry, you see the photo that's up there. I wonder if you might, you know, just sort of highlight some of the major viruses that have affected us. And particularly, I'd be interested in your talking about Jerry Ford when we get there and his whole experience, what happened when he was president.
Sure. Like HIV, that's an interesting one because, you know, like COVID, it's a very complicated virus and we still have not been able to develop a vaccine for it. So, you know, all this talk about, you know, when we get a vaccine, we have to keep in mind that some of these viruses are too elusive and we haven't figured them out. There are several plagues along here. And the one that I would, let's see, the third plague, the screen is covering up, I suppose, the Black Death. But the plague came in different groups. You know, they, like in the 14th century, when it arrived in Sicily, it came from the Mongol horde had laid siege to this city called Kaffa in the Crimean Peninsula. And they were suddenly overwhelmed by, the soldiers were, by this plague. And before they left, they catapulted the bodies into the walled city. And the panicked merchants who lived there got their boats and fled to Italy. And that's where the plague entered in 1356. And it killed as much as half the population of Europe, if you can imagine. And that wasn't the end of it. It recurred, as you can see on this, again and again for about 300 years. Swine flu, the 1976 flu was a swine flu. You know, swine flu, H1N1 is how it's described medically. That was the 1918 flu. It killed between 50 and 100 million people. And in 1976, when I was a young reporter in Atlanta, there was an outbreak. A young recruit named David Lewis had gone on a forced march at Fort Dix, New Jersey, which figured strongly in 1918. And he went back to his barracks and died. He was a healthy young man. And the autopsy showed that he had been affected with H1N1. Well, now this raised the question, what should we do? You know, if you had as many as 100 million people dying in 1918, in more modern terms, it would be, you know, hundreds of millions of people around the world. So, and of course, public health officials had been dreading this ever since 1918. And so they developed a vaccine. They rushed it, as you can imagine. But the question was, you know, do we give it to everybody? As a reporter, I happened to find out that that David Lewis had run into a pig over the Christmas holidays. This is, you know, this is the reporter job. You know, I'd found out, you know, nobody had said this, but his mother told me that over the holidays, David and his girlfriend had been coming home, were in Oneonta, New York, upstate New York. They were coming home from a party and the snow had closed the roads down to just one lane. And as they were driving home at night, they came upon a pig in the middle of the road. And David got out and grabbed him by the ears and pulled him off the road. And the question was, did the pig cough in his face? So if it's animal to human transmission, nothing to worry about. But if it's human to human, then we're in trouble. And so I had to track down the pig, and I found him. It was a house pig. There's a strange story, but I finally convinced the very reluctant owner of the pig to let his vet take some blood and send it to the CDC. And it turned out the pig had never been sick a day in his life. Millions of Americans got vaccinated. Some of them got Guillain-Barré syndrome as a result of it, and the vaccine program was stopped. It was a terrible political blow to Gerald Ford, and the mystery remains. You know, 50 to 100 million people died in 1918 and only one in 1976. Later, that particular strain of flu came back in 2009 as a pandemic, but it wasn't as serious as the ordinary seasonal flu. So that's the weirdness of, you know, these kinds of viruses. They are tricky to work with, and they change constantly.
So remind me again, how long did it take to develop that vaccine?
There was already a flu vaccine. It had to be moderated to accommodate this new H1N1. So it wasn't like having to create an entirely new platform as we are having to do with coronavirus.
So let me work in a question from Al. He says, how did you build up Henry's character? And we have a terrific picture of Dr. Parsons when you tell him about him.
Well, Henry Parsons is his name, and I gave him that name because in the 19th century, this man that you see before you was a country doctor and a botanist, and but he got appointed as an assistant medical officer during the influenza outbreak in London in the 1890s. And at the time, it was thought that influenza, the word is Italian, meaning influences, they thought that it came from environmental gases, miasmas, they were called. And Henry Parsons was the first to conclusively prove that influenza is spread by contagion. It was a major medical breakthrough by a person who's little remembered now, but I decided to borrow his name. Henry exemplifies those qualities that I've spoken of courage and ingenuity that I find so prevalent in the world of public health. I just can't tell you how much I admire them. And as a writer, it's not easy to create a hero in modern day, but it is easy when you look at the people that are doing on the front lines now, fighting this disease. You see heroism wherever you turn. There is a Dallas connection with Henry. Henry has been touched by disease himself. He suffered from rickets as a child. And some of your audience may remember Lonnie Cleaver, who was a professor at SMU, who was a friend of mine. And he had that disease as a child, and it marked him. And I always admired Lonnie's courage and for living through that disease and like getting on with his life.
So when I was reading the book, after a few of the names, and I recognized Richard Clark and one or two other, then I thought, oh, I better start looking up in in Wikipedia.
Some of these people might be real.
Some of these people might be real. And a person who really fascinated me, and then recognized, that he actually won a Nobel Prize and so forth, is the Italian Carlo Urbani. Did you ever know of him, meet him, or?
No, I would love to have met him. He was a great man. Carlo Urbani was he was an Italian doctor. He worked with Doctors Without Borders. In fact, he was one of the ones who accepted the Nobel Prize for that organization. And after that, he went to Vietnam to work with children who were suffering from parasitical worms. And in 2003, a patient came into the hospital in Saigon where he was working, and very ill. He had just gotten off a plane from Hong Kong. And soon doctors and nurses in the hospital began to sicken and die. And the hospital was panicked. The whole city was panicked. And administrators asked Carlo to take over the administration of the hospital, which he did, although his family was very reluctant for him to do that. He told the city authorities how to, create sheltering in place and the kinds of restrictions they would need. And he personally would ferry the tissue and blood samples across town on his moped to the only lab that was still open. And he described the disease. He was the first to do that and recognize it as a novel disease. It's one of the miracles of public health that disease, which is SARS, was contained within 150 days. It's far more fatal than COVID-19. It killed about 10% of all the people that infected. And one of them, unfortunately, was Carlo Urbani.
So one of our viewers said, and I think it's about, obviously, the SARS epidemic. He says, on page 54, you state that China tried to mislead the World Health Organization on the SARS epidemic. Any thoughts about WHO's role right now, and why was WHO so believing of China at this time?
You have to understand about WHO, it has no power. It's a supplicant. It has to be granted permission by member countries of the UN to even come into the country. And what seems sort of abject pleading on the part of the head of the WHO to China is essentially asking permission. For 3 weeks, the Chinese would not let the World Health authorities into the country, even after they had announced the presence of this disease, and that's inexcusable. China's not alone. There are a lot of countries. I set my novel, it started in Indonesia, which has also hid the ball in the past. There are countries that don't want to be stigmatized with the presence of a disease. In Indonesia, they actually established a precedent of claiming ownership of the disease, that, as if it were a national resource, and they should be able to get something out of the investigations and the vaccines and all that come out of Indonesia.
We have another question, and before we started, you were kind enough to show me your whiteboard behind you.
Yeah.
Question is, how did you decide upon the ending of your novel? And I'll add to that, do you plan and outline your books ahead of time?
I can't talk entirely about the ending of the novel because I want readers to be surprised. But let me just say that it came out of research. When I tried to write the screenplay earlier, I hadn't done the research that I needed to do to understand the natural progress of a disease like this and where it might originate. And there's so many different sources for viral diseases, but I think that the kinds of things that we're doing to the planet and so on affect that. And I think that those concerns are reflected in the novel. As for the other question, Jim, remind me what it was exactly. How do I plan to?
Yeah, do you do an outline ahead of time? I mean, do you know where you're going when you sit down and get in that first 50 to 100 pages?
Eventually, I do. Sometimes, just have to discover it. But typically what I do is just keep incredible notes. I use note cards and I make a list. If it's a fictional project like this, or even a nonfiction book, I'll make a list of scenes and, try to organize them in some sort of coherent fashion and make a rough outline out of that. And then I do a lot of drafts. I'm just a person that writes and then rewrites. I feel like what we call writing really is when you rewrite.
Yeah, I know David McCullough still is writing with his fountain pen. Do you write at the computer?
No, I do write at the computer. I don't use a fountain pen. David, I admire terrifically. And he's, like him, I have artifacts of my, writing career, and I still have a typewriter, but I don't use it. But I know young reporters have different techniques, internet techniques, things that I haven't mastered. So I'm really beginning to feel myself being phased out in the same manner.
So we have another question I'd like to bring in. Based on your knowledge about pandemics that you've acquired, what is your take on the way COVID-19 is being handled? And I guess that's a very broad question. You might want to break it into different parts.
Well, I think the question is best put, how's it being handled by various countries? Because it's being handled in many different ways.
Yeah.
And I think what we can observe, Jim, is that, first of all, you made that point about the World Health Organization. It has no authority. There's no global direction for organizing this. There's certainly no rules that nations have to follow. So every country is in it on their own. And you see many different approaches from, Singapore or China. Let's take, China locking everybody down, quarantining hundreds of millions of people. It's an unbelievable task to do that. And then Sweden just deciding to let this wave roll through their population.
And here in the United States, every state or many states are handling it differently.
The point is, every governmental entity is improvising. And, some may succeed better than others. No doubt they will, because they're all different. But without, a coherent strategy, the town next to yours that is not paying attention to safe hygiene rules will undermine the town that is trying its best to follow the rules. This is, the rule of contagious disease is that one city that has a contagious disease gives it to every city. It's just, when the Chinese made that declaration on New Year's Eve that there was a new coronavirus, it was apparent from the beginning that it was going to reach us eventually.
You'll like this, Larry. One of our viewers wrote, "Thanks, don't tell us the spoilers. I just ordered your book." So I recognize this person, Dion. I happen to know that she has a parrot at home. And she says, your book addresses the role of birds in transmitting diseases.
Yeah.
Please comment on this and recognize that, she may hang her parrot off the balcony if you don't answer it right.
All right. Well, most influenzas originate from birds, and typically it's not a bird that gives you the flu. Usually it passes from a bird to an intermediary animal, oftentimes a pig. Pigs are more receptive to avian influenzas, and their lungs are more like humans. So they cook up a variant disease that then is transmissible to humans. So I don't think that unless she has a pig in the house that the parrot's going to be any trouble.
I've been to their home. As far as I know, they don't. And anyway, right now we know it's hard to find pigs.
Yes,
We have to stock up. So Paige asked this really interesting question. Thank you, Paige. As civilians, how are we to decide which reports and reporters are reliable, trustworthy sources for information and guidance?
Well,
Where
it's a
do you
good
recommend
question.
we go?
Right now, we're overwhelmed with speculation and conspiracy theories, and people are fumbling to find out, what can they trust, and it's confounded by the fact that medicine is still struggling to understand this disease. It seems like every week we find out something new about the disease, often things that contradict things that we thought before. It doesn't affect children. Yes, it does. It's a respiratory disease. Well, not just respiratory. It affects the heart, it affects the kidneys, it affects the brain. It's only spread by droplets. Well, no, not. There are so many different variations. It seems like every day we find something new. That doesn't mean that medicine doesn't know what it's doing. It means that medicine is learning. But in the midst of that, you'll hear a lot of conspiracy theories and some medical people with, I think, very spurious ideas, saying that it's not dangerous or that it can be cured by, this formula or that formula. This medicine works. We find out that those things don't work. They have to be tested. And so far, we have not found a reliable cure for this. If you find someone who says that there is a reliable cure, then you should treat that with great skepticism until you've heard about the clinical trials.
So we're going to do our first question by someone who raised their hand. Go ahead, Kirsten.
All right. I'm actually really looking forward to getting my hands on your book. I've heard nothing but rave reviews from Jim. My question is, I'm sure you're sick and tired of all of your predictions actually coming true, but I'm curious if there's anything you didn't predict that you're seeing play out in the COVID era.
Thanks, Kirsten. Yes, I do keep kind of score on myself. I don't want anything else to come true. But then the one thing that I guess my biggest mistake in the novel was underestimating the solidarity of individual people to shelter in place for such a long time at great personal cost, financial, social, even spiritual cost. It's hard. This is beyond the dangers that this disease poses to our health. It's impoverishing. And, this is, I have to say that I'm really impressed with the way that so many people have voluntarily flattened the curve. On the other hand, I have to say that the governments that I depict in the novel behave pretty much as I expected or worse.
Yeah, you have, again, not to be a spoiler, but you certainly have some pretty accurate paragraphs about some of our leaders at the state level as well as federal. I wonder who you interviewed that we're seeing on TV right now. Anybody in particular?
Well, most of the people that I interviewed in the medical field are people that are developing the vaccines. Barney Graham, for instance, is a doctor at the National Institutes of Health, and he oversaw the development of a vaccine. Originally was designed for MERS, the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, which killed more than 30% of the people that it infected. Thank God we're not facing that. But when the disease died down, so did the funding. But fortunately, there was a platform, and that's the first of the vaccines to go into human trials. And they hope they might have something on a limited emergency basis by this fall. Philip Dormitzer is the head chief scientific officer at Pfizer, and he's overseeing the Pfizer vaccine as well. Then there were people inside the Fort Detrick, which is,
let's go into more detail about what that is.
Fort Detrick used to be the where we did our bioweapons development. Since the Nixon administration, it's been said that we have abandoned that, but we still do develop diseases in order to develop possible vaccines against them. So in a way, we're on guard. The Soviets never stopped, and it's unclear if the Russians have. Vladimir Putin has bragged about developing genetic weapons, which is a little unclear what that is. But it's, Fort Detrick is one of the mainstays of our national health complex. And I was able to visit a level 4 containment facility, which is the highest level of laboratories for biological experimentation at Fort Detrick. And Jens Kuhn, one of the chief scientific people there, was a terrific help in guiding me through the kinds of problems that scientists there face.
Lynn Parsons asks an interesting question. Larry, you wrote this book several years ago. Actually, I guess you really finished it about a year ago, isn't that right?
I turned it in June or July.
And so many things are actually happening today. If you knew how this would play out, and I have to assume there were others in the world who did, why didn't the appropriate people take action? And do you think they ever will in the future? In other words, will we learn from what we're experiencing now? Thank you, Lynn.
I have to say, I'm very dismayed by, the handling of this outbreak in the United States, because the information was there. People in government, most of the time, had, the scientists at NIH, for instance, in Fort Detrick, they had, spent their entire careers studying viruses and looking for the next big one. And there were tabletop exercises at Johns Hopkins and elsewhere almost every year, describing scenarios very much like the one we're going through. And I made use of them in my novel. I mean, and briefing books were handed off to the administration. George W. Bush had started, had an early campaign to up our preparedness. And the Obama administration prepared a briefing book to hand off to the Trump administration. Everything that you would need to know that the modern state of science and our procedure would have been in that briefing book. And I don't know where it is now, but it's certainly not on top of the president's desk.
So Shelley Mathis, and I don't think you're giving it away too much here, the character of the president in your book is very familiar. Were you inspired by President Trump, or would you have created this type of personality otherwise to show how insensitive people can become when they think their lives are threatened?
I know that there is a similarity. I don't claim that it's, represents any particular person, but I wanted to represent the world we live in right now. And I created a calendar for the progress of my disease, the novel that the disease I invented. And I decided that it would resemble the 1918 flu in terms of its progress. So it starts in early spring, just as the Spanish flu did. And so far, the calendar I created just for the purposes of the novel, I decided to set it in 2020. So, on my computer, I have where my hero is, on a certain day and so on. But basically, it's following the same path: the Spanish flu, the novel, the flu in the novel and the COVID-19 are tracking very closely. I wanted it to feel like it's happening now. So I thought creating a kind of phony president, somebody that you know is not there, would undermine the sense of reality that I was trying to achieve without actually trying to lay the blame at any one individual.
Yeah, but you did a phony president who appointed his vice president to be the head of the task force.
Lucky guess, Jim. I just, I mean, I look at my strategy is to look at the way the world really is, and then add stress and see what happens. And that's where the novel comes from.
Let's talk about the word stress for a minute, because reading your book and reading many of your books, you feel the tension. I mean, you do write page turners, whether it's fiction or nonfiction. It's such an art. How do you go about doing that?
Tension is what you're asking about? Well,
suspense.
Events.
Suspense.
A friend of mine years ago taught me about the rubber band theory. And the rubber band is, let's say, something happens. For instance, in the Looming Tower is a great example, I think, of the rubber band. One of my characters, Prince Turki al-Faisal, is the mosque, the Grand Mosque in Mecca has been taken over, and he's rushing to the scene where there's snipers up in the minarets, you know, these radical Muslims have taken over. And he starts to go to the temporary headquarters of the army that is set up to try to retake the mosque. And a shot rings out, and the glass door that he's about to open explodes in front of him. And if you could say, and then he did this, but the rubber band theory says when a shot rings out or any important event like that, stop. You know, use the moment to fill in that case, for instance, the fact that the bin Laden family built that mosque, the fact that the clergy and the Saudi royal family had to make a deal in order to address this violence inside the holy area that would affect the rest of history in Saudi Arabia. All of those things you can talk about now, all the while the reader is thinking, what happens? He remembers that a shot has rung out and the prince is standing there with a door in his hand. And so when you get back to it, by that time, the reader has gotten the information that you wanted to put in his mind that would otherwise just be dry, rote information. But it adds to not only the suspense, but it creates more drama around the moment itself.
Well, you are indeed a master at it. What are you working on now?
Well, I'm writing a New Yorker story about, I found this medical historian in Bologna, Italy, and I was interested in the question of what happens next after COVID-19, after this horrible pandemic, what has happened in the past with other diseases. And so she's a specialist on the Black Death. I don't want to compare the toll, but the Black Death is interesting to me. It's a hopeful example because the Black Death really put an end to the Middle Ages and opened the door to the Renaissance. So there's a question about what can we learn from this experience, and will we make some adjustments in our own societies?
Larry, you wrote a lot about faith in this book, and in talking about how Dr. Parsons developed his own thoughts about life and religion throughout the book, did it in any way affect your own thinking?
Well, I have written my entire career, Jim. I've always been fascinated by why people believe one thing or another. And it's been my observation that people with strong political beliefs, that might not affect their behavior at all. But people with strong religious beliefs, their lives are governed by, their beliefs. And I think as reporters, we often neglect the power of faith. And so I'm not a believer myself, but as a young teenager in Dallas, I was. And I know how it affects people. And I'm curious about that quality. And of course, I still have interest in it. So I'm intrigued by religious ideas and spiritual journeys. And my character is on a journey, and I relate to that.
Well, I found it so interesting to watch Henry's character develop. It was just so well done, and I don't want to give anything away, but saying how it affected my own views. I think we have a few viewers who want to play the stock market, and they want to say, what are you predicting next? Asks Alana and Ray Termini. Ray Termini says, what frightening disaster are you thinking about writing next?
Well, I've had a lot of people suggest to me that, you know, why don't you write something good for a change, you know, like a woman president, or, you know, solving climate change. And I take these all under advisement. But no, the thing that I've been doing that's fun is I've been working on a musical about Texas politics with my friend Marcia Ball. And we've had a wonderful time doing that. So I take a break every once in a while from the dire imaginings that I sometimes indulge in. I do think that in terms of predictions, I'm not predicting this, but I'm cautious of the geopolitical fallout that we'll be experiencing from COVID-19. All the, you know, these terrible diseases, pandemics like this, come freighted with blame and stigma and shame. And, you know, you see the accusations that we are making against China and vice versa, and Russia and Korea. And, these accusations are unfounded and dangerous, and they stir up hatred. And hatred develops its own constituency. So I worry about the fallout from this.
And that's a good segue to a question we have from Maria from Virginia Beach, talking about partisanship and responding to this pandemic than in prior pandemics and epidemics, wearing masks versus not wearing masks. Do you think it's because of lack of leadership, Maria asks, and distrust of government, a growing distrust of science, anti-vaccine movement, or a deliberate attempt to create a partisan divide? Thank you, Maria, for that.
Gosh, I think all of those things apply. But it's very dismaying to me to see, the question of wearing a mask become a partisan issue. We're talking about people's health and safety, and not just the person wearing the mask. You endanger other people when you decide not to wear a mask or not to obey the rules. And I was running around the hike and bike trail in Austin the other day, and we're supposed to all run in clockwise direction, but about 20% of the people running in the opposite direction. And there are signs saying, this way. And yet there are people that is just, and I'm always puzzled by it because, there are certain people who are simply immune to scorn. And, but I finally stopped one of the runners and said, why are you running this way? And she said, well, this is the way I always run.
Russell wants to know, were you influenced by any other fiction works about pandemics? What should we read if we want to dig more into this?
There are so many interesting books about pandemics. Tops on my list, I guess, is Pale Horse, Pale Rider. Since we're all Texans here, I'll advertise Catherine Ann Porter. She actually got the flu in 1918. She was then a young reporter for the Denver Post. And, she wrote a little novel about it, but in real life, she was so ill that her newspaper set her obituary in type. When she finally came to, she was bald. Her hair grew back white for the rest of her life. But her novel is so moving and skillfully told. When I was a young reporter, I read a book that was then called Epidemic and Peace 1918 by Alfred W. Crosby. And it's been retitled now. It's called America's Forgotten Pandemic. But the word forgotten is a key one because the 1918 flu was simply buried in the historical consciousness. people didn't talk about it. And yet it killed, it was overshadowed by the war, but it killed far more soldiers in that war than the war itself. In fact, it killed more American soldiers than all the American soldiers that died in all the wars in the 20th century. World War I, World War II, Korea, Afghanistan, Iraq, just 675,000 Americans died in 1918. So that book did a great service in bringing it back to life. I've been reading it. I doubt that a lot of people will take me up on this, but there's a famous Italian novel called The Decameron, and it's about 10 friends in plague-ridden Florence in the 14th century, sheltering in place and telling stories. And it gives you a window on the mentality of people in the middle of the plague, and you can almost feel the shift from the Middle Ages to the new thinking of the Renaissance.
So hopefully we're going to get to the other side of this. I heard Mark Cuban, the owner of the Dallas Mavericks, talk, or it was an interview, and he said to go to a Mavericks game, you might have to let them know when you arrive in your parking space, and they would let people come in small groups, and they might even give you something like a hoodie to wear, so that if anybody sneezed on you, you could immediately take this off. So it doesn't sound like a lot of fun. So is there going to be a Super Bowl next year? What about Mardi Gras? I mean, how do you see all this? I mean, you look at this picture, we got 100,000 people. What do you think is the future for athletics and big events?
I think that we'll see empty stands for a while. I suspect that we will see sports again, but the testing is possible. You can test, the entire team and the staff that goes out on the court or on the field, but you cannot test all those people in the stadium. And it would be foolhardy, I think, until we get a vaccine to press people that many people together. I think we have to take it more slowly, and it's too early to tell when we can actually get back. We'd like for it to happen soon, but Jim, without a vaccine, the virus is not going to go away until we have some kind of herd immunity, and that can take as long as 2 years.
So you're one of the most astute observers I know of Texas politics. And Dan Patrick, our lieutenant governor, certainly has taken one side. I think the city council in Austin is probably sort of a different side. Let's move slowly. How do you see what's happening, this division in our own state?
Well, Texas is fortunate in that it hasn't been touched as hard as many of the other states. And so we're lucky in that regard. There's some things about the opening that I endorse. I think, opening retail stores at a limited capacity is fine. I have mixed feelings about the experience with restaurants, but, there are a lot of restaurants that just simply can't make a go of it at 25% of their capacity. So, only some of them are actually working. I think nail salons and beauty salons and barbershops, that's too risky. So I think that that's a real problem. But I'm also very sensitive to the fact that we're dealing with an economic catastrophe. And the longer this goes on, the more damage will be done. What we don't want to do is open up too quickly, allow the disease to gain more strength, spread more rapidly, and then we have to close down again at even greater cost and far greater dismay and spiritual loss among the population. We have to be prepared to endure this, and the only ways we can fight it, really, until we get a vaccine, we're creating therapies. I have some hope, for instance, that plasma therapy will bring relief to, save a lot of lives. But unfortunately, you can't scale it up very much. There are these latest drugs that people have been advertising don't have much of an effect. And so right now, it's ironic when we use the word quarantine, that's a word that came out of the Middle Ages. And it's still the technique that we're using to address this problem 700 years later.
Well, Larry, it's a remarkable book. You're a remarkable author, a great journalist, and really appreciate you spending time with us. Is there any closing thought that you'd want to say before we thank you officially and take off?
Yes, one thing I wanted to say, had I been able to address you in person, I would have dressed up a little bit and I would have worn this tie.
Oh, that's absolutely. Right. I gave you
last time we met, I spoke about Texas, and this is his Texas tie. He stripped it off his neck. So I was very touched by that. I guess my final thought, besides thanking Pat Patterson for her support on this, we will be a different country after this is over. And I think there's something about a war or a depression and a pandemic that it's like an X-ray that allows you to see into your society more deeply than ever before. And I think we're all aware of our shortcomings as a society, and we have the opportunity to remedy them. Whether we will is up to us. We did in the Depression. We reshaped our country during the Depression and made it stronger and more unified, more cohesive. We did in World War II. 9/11 was a very mixed experience for us. But so we have risen to it in the past, and we have not quite done so in the recent past. So we have a chance to show that we can make changes in our society that make us a better, stronger, healthier society. And I just hope we take that opportunity.
Again, Larry, I want to thank you for being with us. And if you'd like to support our program, please go to DFW World and text DFW World to 44321. And as I mentioned, Larry just recently had a wedding in his family, so I bet he would love for you to buy a copy of his book, the end of October. You can go to interabangbooks.com or at your nearest independent bookstore. Larry, again, many thanks. Thanks again.
Thanks, Jim.